I'm happy to be here. I've been in Japan before talking about minimum wages, and I gather, as in many places, the debate is still ongoing. This is a topic I've been studying, 30 years, almost 30 years, which is hard to believe. And what I'm going to talk about today is some evidence that really helps us, or I hope helps us, and helps you figure out how to sort out what is, in fact, a lot of conflicting evidence. So let me start by just giving you a sense of how much the evidence seems to conflict. These are some claims by various types, some media statements at the top of my slide. One, a statewide $15 minimum wage is a bad idea, and the second headline, why a $15 minimum wage is good economics. So that's reporters. Fine, they can disagree, but economists also disagree. Two very similar quotes, a $15 wage won't cost New York jobs. This was in reference to a proposal to raise the minimum wage in New York State, and then in reference to a proposal to do it in California. By 2022, approximately 400,000 jobs would be lost. So there's obviously a lot of disagreement. There's actually two kinds of disagreement, and I'm going to focus more on the first. I think it'll be more helpful to this audience. The second, I will also touch on. It's a little more technical. But as I'm looking at the slide, I realize I'm going to do this in reverse order, but we'll see. Okay. So the first question, which I think is one that researchers spend a lot of time on, is how should we estimate minimum wage effects? So most research that evaluates policy uses some version of, you take two regions, it could be countries, it could be states, it could be, in Japan's case, prefectures, and the policy changes in one and it doesn't change in the other, and we study how the outcome changes where the policy changed compared to where the policy doesn't change. That's a very simple way to put what, if you picked up a paper, would look a lot fancier and more technical. There's a lot of papers like this on the minimum wage. Most of them, not all, but most are on the U.S., and the U.S. is a natural place to study, simply, not because it's more important, but simply because we have 50 states, and while a state cannot have a minimum wage lower than the federal minimum wage, it can have a minimum wage higher than the federal minimum wage. So we have a lot of different states with a lot of different minimum wages. So working with Bill Washer, who's at the Federal Reserve Board, we worked together for a long time. We surveyed this research and reached the conclusion that essentially most of the studies find negative effects on jobs. And I want to interpret the magnitude, because we'll keep coming back to this. Labor economists describe typically minimum wage research in terms of the elasticity. So these studies, not every single one, but a lot of them show what we call an elasticity in the -0.1 to -0.2 range, which means that a 10% increase in the minimum wage, let's say, would reduce employment by 1 to 2%. So it's the percent change in employment divided by the percent change in the minimum wage. So that's kind of what, at least a lot of studies, when we summarize these, I think if I use this pointer, you'll see it. Nope. Yes. Oh, maybe not. Okay, never mind. When we surveyed these around 15 years ago. There's been a sustained critique of a lot of this research. You don't have to read the long quotes, they're just there, you're welcome to. But essentially, this critique argues that you can't really just use differences between where the minimum wage went up and where it didn't, because where it went up and where it didn't may be associated with other things driving the labor market. Politicians may pass the minimum wage when times are good. They may pass the minimum wage when times are bad. And therefore, while we sort of interpret these studies as kind of mimicking or copying an experiment, even though, of course, they're not real experiments, when the minimum wage isn't really close to a sign randomly, when it's correlated with other changes in the economy, you can get the wrong answer. And these studies claim that two things. One is when you take account of this problem, you actually find that there really isn't an effect of the minimum wage on employment. And secondly, how do they do that? They argue that the way you have to do that is by looking at areas that are very close to each other. So in the US, for example, there's a famous paper by David Card and Alan Kruger that looks essentially at New Jersey, which is a pretty small state, and just across the border in Pennsylvania, just kind of the area near the border. There are studies from developing countries where you have sort of a big city split between two provinces, and one province raises its minimum wage and one doesn't. The most famous paper, I think, and the one I'm going to focus on is the one discussed at the bottom of my slide, Dubé, Lester, and Reich. I'll refer to it as DLR for short, where they look at counties on opposite sides of state borders. So we have, as most of you probably know, 50 states in the U.S. States are divided into counties. There's a lot of them, and how many there are depends on the state. But they're kind of smaller areas. They can be smaller than a big city and bigger than a small city is probably the best way to think about them. So so that's one part of the debate over minimum wages. Like, what's the best study, or are some studies just wrong? The other puzzle or debate, which I find really puzzling, is that economists just disagree about what all the papers say. Now, if we all read the same papers, you might say, I might prefer one study and Daiji might prefer another study, but don't we agree on what all the studies say? Well, here's just some examples. I'll just read the quotes in yellow. This is a letter signed by a couple of Nobel Prize winners and a few other famous economists. The last decade has seen a wealth of rigorous academic research on the effect of minimum wage increases, and just paraphrasing, little or no negative effects on employment of low-wage workers. So that's a point of view that says that the research says that minimum wages don't reduce employment. Here's a middle ground. This is from Carden Kruger's kind of 20th anniversary reissue of their famous book. And they say the literature after our book was about equally likely to find positive as negative effects, with a typical estimate close to zero. So that kind of says there's some positive, there's some negative, but on balance, the evidence doesn't lean one way or another. And here's a third view. Minimum wage, the evidence generally points to job loss, the quote in the middle. My reading of the economics literature leads me to conclude that the weight of the evidence suggests that minimum wage increases lead to non-negligible employment reductions. Well, you can see why people might be confused and trying to argue about does the minimum wage reduce employment or not. So I think it's perfectly natural for academics to argue about which study is better. It's kind of what we do. It's our job to some extent, to do something better than others have done it before in terms of research. I think it's much more odd and much more rare for researchers or others to prevent very different summaries of the same literature. And I want to try to help you sort that out. So I'm going to focus on both of these. What do we really learn from looking at the whole, and I want to say whole US literature on minimum wage effects on jobs? I'm not talking about the international literature. There's a lot of it. It's not as easy to compare. Other countries can have very different systems, from a national minimum wage, which is very hard to estimate the effect of because it's the same everywhere, to collectively bargain minimum wages. So I'm talking about the U.S. context where the minimum wage is set by governments, both federal and state, which I gather is actually quite similar to Japan. Although you have minimum wages set by my understanding is by the national government, although they vary across regions. And the second point is this issue of which kind of study should we believe? Can we resolve the conflict between conclusions from different types of studies? So let me first talk about the issue of what does the whole literature say. And this started, honestly, a grad student and I were talking about this. He asked me, well, what does the whole literature say? And figuring if anyone should know, I should know, because I've been studying this for 30 years. And I said, I don't really know. We should figure this out. So we wanted to try to sort out some way of surveying the U.S. literature to draw conclusions that could maybe be easily conveyed to others. So what we did was we put together a large database of all of the studies since 1992 in the U.S. And why 1992? Because 1992 was the first time that research started using this state variation in minimum wages, which is actually useful to learn about the employment effects. There simply wasn't much state variation before that. So we drew from some surveys. We did we spent a lot of time trying to make sure we were capturing every published study. and we did capture 70 published papers in this study. And then we went to the papers and actually the authors of the studies to really figure out what was their preferred estimate, right? If they had to say, from my study, I learned or I concluded that the elasticity of employment with respect to the minimum wage, like that minus 0.1, minus 0.2 number I mentioned before, what would that be for your study? And most of them responded, and when they didn't, then we read, we sort of figured it out on our own from the paper. So this is not an easy picture to read. There's, especially on the left, you can't see all that little tiny writing. But the visual impression is what you need here. So this is a summary of the estimated elasticities from all those studies. And the shading, the dark, there's kind of a black, gray, and I guess really light gray. That has to do with the statistical significance, how sure we are the estimate is different from zero. So when you see a dark bar, that means we're quite sure the estimate is different from zero. You could see the zero line in the middle, which would be no effective minimum wages on employment. And then you could see a dashed line. I'm going to try one more time with this pointer to see if it works. Oh, it does. Okay. I got to move it slowly. These lines here are different measures of the average effects. And you could see they're centered between, maybe you can't see this, but between minus 0.1 and minus 0.2, which is the range of estimates I mentioned before. But the most striking thing from this graph, if you're going to take away one thing from this webinar, is that most of the estimates are negative, right? This is where most of the estimates are from these studies. There are some studies that find positive effects. There's one or two that find unbelievable positive effects. There are some studies that find no effect, but clearly most of the research, and again, here I'm just, in a sense, taking every paper seriously. I'm not getting into what's a better paper, what's a worse paper. I'll come back to that. If you do that, though, you say minimum wages reduce employment. This slide, I shrunk the top slide, and I just give you some of the numbers. So the mean elasticity, the average elasticity across studies is minus 0.148, minus 0.15, right in the middle of that range I talked about earlier from a much earlier survey. Okay. I would view this evidence as clearly at odds with the conclusion that the minimum wage literature says there's no effect of minimum wages on employment. You simply can't, at least looking across all the studies, reach that conclusion. Okay. Now, oops, I'm giving away the punchline here, but one argument you might get is, well, yeah, but your research has gotten better and better and better over time, and I hope that's true. We all try to do that. Maybe the more recent studies show us that minimum wages don't reduce employment. Well, all I've done here, it's a funny looking graph, but I've taken those exact same lines from the other graph, and I've just put them in chronological order, from earliest at the top to most recent, latest at the bottom. And it sure looks like there's no relationship between what studies find and time, essentially. And in fact, that's true. There's essentially a zero correlation between the estimated effect of minimum wages and, let's say, the year the study was done. So there's no evidence that, yeah, we used to mistakenly believe that minimum wages reduce employment, but now we've learned they don't. Okay. There's also some estimates we see that are kind of consistent with what I'll call the standard, or what economists call the neoclassical story, which is that we think minimum wages should reduce employment the most for the ones whose wages they push up the most, right? The very least skilled should be the ones who would get a wage increase if they keep their job, of course, but they're also the ones whose wage the government has made more expensive by raising the minimum wage, and they therefore may be the ones more likely to suffer job loss. This is a set of studies for less educated workers, and you can see that, again, most of the estimates are negative, and in fact, they're bigger than the overall set of estimates, bigger negative numbers, so more job loss for the less educated. This is a graph for a small set of studies that look directly at minimum wage workers before the minimum wage goes up. So I use the phrase directly affected. These are people, so I might look at the less educated, and I just said the minimum wage has a bigger effect on them. Why? Because if you have a master's degree, the minimum wage probably has no effect on your job. You earn too much for it to matter. If you're less educated, you're more likely to be a minimum wage worker, but not everyone. The directly affected, by definition, are all earning the minimum wage, so the minimum wage will reduce their employment the most, and the studies say they do. Now, there's one exception, which is right here. This is the subset of studies that get away from looking at workers defined by skill, low-skill workers of one form or another, and instead look at low-wage industries, most commonly retail and restaurants, which in the U.S., and I bet the same is true in Japan, although I don't know this, are the two industries with the biggest share of low-wage workers. What you see here is studies that seem more centered on zero. You look across these studies, there's the zero line, right? And the studies are, there's some more negative, there's some more positive. You wouldn't look at this graph, unlike the previous one, and say, oh, the evidence is mainly consistent with job loss. Here, the evidence is, on average at least, consistent with no effect on jobs. Now, you might say, okay, so maybe minimum wage, when I look at industries, minimum wages don't reduce employment. Doesn't that mean minimum wages aren't harmful? Well, you have to keep in mind that you learn something different when you look at low-wage industries than when you look at low-skilled workers. And the reason is the following. If I look at low-skilled workers, and you think about a worker whose productivity is low, the minimum wage goes up, the employer may decide not to keep all those workers employed because no employer wants to employ a worker who costs more than the worker produces for them. That would be irrational. And we don't think employers do that. So low-skilled workers, if the minimum wage goes up, may lose their job. But now imagine you're an employer in a low-wage industry. Say you have a restaurant, right? And the minimum wage goes up. Well, you indeed might get rid of some of the lowest skilled workers, but you also might replace them with some higher skilled workers because you can't run a restaurant with no workers. But you might switch from, say, 4 less skilled workers to 3 somewhat higher quality workers whose productivity is high enough that it still makes sense to employ them at the minimum wage. So what does that example give us? 4 people lost their job, the 4 low-skilled workers. But only 1 job was eliminated in the industry because you replaced them with 3 low-skilled workers. So in other words, when you look at an industry, you could have a lot of substitution between different kinds of workers, but it's not necessarily good news because it masks the fact that the lowest skilled workers, the lowest wage workers, still lost their jobs. So now if you want to ask, what is the minimum wage going to do to employment in an industry, this is a perfectly reasonable way to approach the data. Right? It does answer that question. But if you say, look, we're raising the minimum wage, and I think every government would say this, to help the lowest wage workers by raising their wage, the industry studies can be quite misleading because they can mask the changes in who's actually employed from lower wage to higher wage. So what do I conclude from that large set of studies and all those graphs and everything else? I conclude that the evidence shows that the minimum wage in the U.S. context does reduce employment unless you discard or throw away or ignore a lot of it. So remember I read you those 3 quotes at the beginning that take very different views of what the minimum wage research says. Not what one study says, but what the overall research says. And we conclude, and this is a quote from our paper, concluding that the research evidence as a whole fails to find disemployment effects of minimum wages requires discarding or ignoring most of the evidence. Now, you might read that as saying, well, okay, you're just saying it's ridiculous to conclude that the minimum wage doesn't reduce employment. I'm not really saying that because there's still an open question, which is, are some of the studies really getting the wrong answer? Are some studies done well, and are some studies, perhaps many studies, done badly? If you go back to the critique of the sort of typical study that I mentioned earlier, the folks who believe that minimum wages are kind of not determined in a manner that's kind of random, but in fact increased maybe when times are good, maybe when times are bad, argue that most of the research is in fact misleading and in fact gives you the wrong answer, and a small set of studies gives you the right answer. So now I want to turn to that question. Like, are they right or are they wrong? Should we believe most of the evidence, or should we believe most of the evidence is wrong? And that's obviously a very important distinction for this literature. Okay, so this is the second paper which I'm going to turn to now. So this gets a little more technical, so I'm not going to get into a lot of details. But essentially, there's a conflict in the research literature. And the conflict is between what I call in this slide panel data estimators. What does that mean? That's the kind of approach I talked about before, where you just, for example, take states that raised the minimum wage in the US context versus all states that didn't, and compare changes across those two subsets of states. So if in the states that raised the minimum wage, low skill employment declines more than in the states that didn't, roughly speaking, the research will find that minimum wage has reduced employment. The second strategy is what I call close controls, or geographically close controls, and that's like the famous Kruger paper. It's like the Dube, Lester, and Reich, the DLR paper, and I'm going to talk explicitly about that one. It's a lot more recent, which says you can only get the right answer when you look at places really close together. Now, let me just give you the intuition. It's not a crazy argument. In fact, it's a somewhat compelling argument. So here's the idea. If you think that where the minimum wage goes up is associated with other changes in economic conditions, then when I compare two places that are far apart, there might have been very different changes in economic conditions, and the minimum wage may get confounded or confused with that. If I zoom in on a small geographic area where there's a state border, and on one side the minimum wage went up and the other side it didn't, maybe the economic shocks, the other economic outcomes associated with minimum wages are the same on both sides of the border and wash out. So that's the intuition. In this paper, we do that strategy. We do it a little differently than the DLR paper, what we think is a more sensible way to do it. Yet we don't find any evidence that minimum wages reduce employment. We get a very different answer than this new literature that critiques most of the evidence actually finds. So I have to get into a little detail here. This I already said, so I'm going to skip this slide. And this one I also already said. I got ahead of myself. So let me jump to this one. Okay. So I'm going to now give you a little more detail. Don't worry about all the details in the slide. I'll tell you what the main point is. Essentially, there's around 5 or 6 main studies in this much larger literature which use a version of this close control strategy. So the first one is the Dube, Lester, and Reich, which is the paired counties on opposite sides of the border. Then there are 4 others with that same dark blue shading. I suppose I could have included Kruger here, but that's a very different study, so I didn't. Then there's one other one, and kind of light blue at the bottom. The 5 studies at the top all more or less reach the same conclusion. Minimum wages don't reduce employment, whether you look at restaurant workers, teenagers, 2 different ways of studying the minimum wage. The one exception is the study by Liu et al., which is a little bit different because it actually, and this is very important, it doesn't just arbitrarily say, oh, let's look at counties on either side of the border. Remember, the intuition for this approach is you want to use places on 2 sides of the border that have very similar economies, very similar economic shocks. If you don't do that, this approach doesn't buy you anything. So when you take all counties on opposite side of borders, they may not share much economic activity. The Liu et al. Paper uses what are called Bureau of Economic Analysis, economic areas, which are based on very similar, so these are areas on different sides of state borders, not necessarily all counties, but they are areas that have very similar industrial composition. So they really should be hit by the same shocks. And interestingly, in their paper, I'll point to it so you can make sure you know what I'm looking at, they get a minus 0.17 elasticity for teenagers, which is very much like the existing studies. So that's a clue that kind of what's on either side of the border, is it an area that's essentially the same economy or not, is very important. And I'm going to flip back just because I didn't say this. That's why the title of the paper starts with, what's across the border, right? That's actually important, and you need to explore it before you decide what the data says. Okay, let me jump back to where I was. So I want to be clear here. This critique in the recent minimum wage literature that says you got to really think carefully about where minimum wages go up and whether those changes are associated with other economic changes that can kind of lead you to get the wrong answer is important. I'm not saying it's not important. The question is, do they get the right answer? Other researchers agree with me, and this slide lists 4 studies that in quite different ways try to address the same problem. I won't go into all the detail, it doesn't matter. But one is a sort of very technical approach. One is an approach that looks for sources of what we call exogenous variation in minimum wages, something that gets you closer to the experimental ideal, if you will. And the third, which I will explain because it's more intuitive, is to essentially add another level of control. So I might, for example, be looking at the very lowest wage workers, asking whether the minimum wage reduces their employment, and we saw that it does. Well, you might say, well, okay, but if I take this critique seriously, maybe minimum wages happened to go up where the labor market for low-wage workers was declining anyways. And that leads you to get the wrong answer. So what people do, and I'll talk about the study at the bottom of the slide here, Clemens and Wither, they don't just do this study for the estimation for the lowest wage workers. They do a comparison between them and somewhat higher wage workers. Low wage still, so they're probably affected by the same economic outcomes, but high enough that the minimum wage doesn't actually affect their employment. And now if I kind of compare the two groups and what happens when the minimum wage goes up, I can get more reliable evidence on the minimum wage. These are the 4 studies that were in that slide. And interestingly, all 4 of them, there's my pointer, all 4 of them find pretty strong negative effects of minimum wages. So there's an important conclusion you can draw here. And this still doesn't get to which study is right and which study is wrong. But the important conclusion is that what determines whether you find job loss or not is not simply whether you take account of the fact that minimum wages might be correlated with other economic outcomes, a problem you should wrestle with, you should take seriously as a researcher. But it actually, 3 out of the 4 strategies that have been used to address that problem still find job loss. So as I say here in the 4th bullet, the issue is not whether you consider these shocks, whether you consider these biases, as we call them, in estimated effects of minimum wages on employment, but how you do it. And in particular, the question is, do the studies that use close controls, like DLR, get the wrong answer or the right answer? And if they get the wrong answer, even better, can we figure out why? So that's the last point I'm going to get into. I already mentioned that this Liu et al. Study uses regions that are supposed to have integrated economies. So this is kind of the ideal setting, if you will, for the close controls approach, because this is a setting where we think if the minimum wage goes up on one side of the border and not the other, and I look just within these economic areas, think about these as kind of large geographic areas on both sides of the border, that should satisfy the critics of the other kind of minimum wage studies, because you're now taking account of economic shocks. And if the shocks are the same, you should get a reliable estimate. Okay, and you get a negative estimate like most studies. What about just looking at cross-border counties? Are those actually good controls? Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe you need a different kind of area. So there's this. I know this is confusing. There's a lot of jargon, but there are also regions into which the U.S. is divided, which are called commuting zones. And a commuting zone, excuse me, is an area in which almost everybody who lives in that area also works in that area. So you kind of you think about a map, you put a dot where everybody lives, you also put a dot where almost everybody, well, you put a dot where everyone works, and you try to draw a shape where that captures almost all the people who live there. A few might, drive really far away, but most don't. Those are also similar economic areas because people are commuting to the same jobs. Now, interestingly, 2 of the 3 authors of the DLR paper actually said in another paper, using commuting zones is appealing because these areas are not only contiguous, i.e. next to each other, they are also demonstrably linked with each other by an economically meaningful criterion. So commuting zones sound like a good way to control for shocks on two sides of the border, and counties may or may not be. That's what this quote says from two of the same authors of the study. So we reevaluate their evidence, and we switch to using commuting zones, specifically those that cross state lines, so multi-state commuting zones, and see how the evidence varies. Here's just a map of what these commuting zones are. So every line you see here draws the borders of a commuting zone. The gray ones, for example, somewhere in the middle of Texas, that's a commuting zone within Texas. The blue ones, like this one right here on the New Mexico-Texas border, that's a multi-state commuting zone. It covers 2 states. They occasionally cover 3 states, but most cover 2. And obviously, those commuting zones that are multi-state tend to be in more urban areas. Not necessarily, but they tend to be. Okay. We can actually compare this, that's the same map on the left, to the map of the cross-border counties that DLR use. And that's what you see on the right. The key takeaway from comparing these two maps is what I say right at the bottom of the slide. There are a lot of cross-border county pairs or counties that are not in the same commuting zone. So for example, let me zoom in on, I'm trying to look at this map closely and see where's a good place to look. Okay, so for example, right here, that's Florida, and its border with, if I have my geography right, Georgia, and I think a little bit of Alabama and Mississippi. I might be wrong about that. Oh, Louisiana way at the end. So, and you can see there's a narrow line there, and what are these? These are just the sets of counties where you have someone on one side of the border, one side of the other, but they touch the border. Are they in a multi-state commuting zone? You may not be able to see. There's a little tiny one right at the edge, but generally no, you don't see that line there. Or take this border of, and I'm really testing, Arkansas with, I should have labeled the states. Whatever's on the other side here, Kentucky and something else, I think. Those are cross-border counties. None of those, except maybe right at the top, are in a multi-state commuting zone. So you're looking at very different places. And in particular, DLR over on this side are looking at a lot of pairs of counties that don't really share economic shocks. So it's not clear why looking at those would help with the problem they talk about. Turns out you get very different answers. So I'm going to show you here, this is one of only 2 regression tables I'm going to show you. What these are, you really just want to look at the top estimates here. Those are elasticities. The number of stars tells you how significant, how sure we are it's different from 0. Okay. This top row here is the original estimates from DLR. When they do a standard estimator, sort of using just comparisons between counties where the minimum wage went up and where it didn't, they get a pretty standard negative estimate of minimum wages on employment. But when they restrict attention to the variation within these pairs of counties on opposite side of the border, the effect goes to 0. That, in fact, is their main point and their main conclusion on which they base the quote I read you much earlier, that once you account for the correlation between minimum wages and other shocks, there's no effect on employment. Here we do it with the commuting zones. We have a couple different data sets, it doesn't matter. And what you see here is that now you get a negative estimate no matter what. And the estimate barely declines, maybe a tiny bit, but barely declines when you look within commuting zones on opposite sides of the border. And what it suggests is when you correctly control for economic shocks that could be associated with minimum wage changes, by using places that are actually integrated economies, you actually don't get much evidence of bias, don't get much evidence that most of the studies out there are wrong. In fact, we kind of confirm those studies. The question is still why, right? So what I've shown you so far is you do it one way, you get one answer. You do it another way, you get another answer, which is fine and interesting, but that doesn't really tell you what to believe. The question is, can I convince you that the cross-border county design that DLR uses is actually maybe giving you a misleading estimate? And let me turn to some evidence that I think it is. So first of all, remember what I said at the outset, that there is an intuitive appeal to this argument that using two places on opposite sides of the border, one to control for the other, may actually be a smart thing to do. But the requirement for that, and it's only an assumption in the DLR paper, it's not proven in any way, shape, or form, it's only an assumption that the economic shocks are similar on both sides of the border. And while that may be intuitively appealing as an argument, it may not be true. Economic shocks, now I am sure it is true that if I look at, let's say, that Florida-Georgia border, and I look on two sides, so I look at Florida and Georgia, let's say, that at any point in time, the economic shocks that hit those two states are more similar than the economic shocks that hit, say, Florida and California, states that are very far away. But it's also true, and this is the critical point, that the minimum wage differences between states that are close to each other are typically a lot smaller, right? So we have a lot of regional minimum wage variation in the U.S. They're very high in some regions and very low in others. And what matters is just not whether the shocks are more similar, but how big or small that is relative to how big the minimum wage differences are. And that's a reason why this intuitively appealing idea of using cross-border counties, if you don't actually fully control for the shock, could make the bias worse, could lead you actually to a positive bias even. And in fact, you also might argue, and we have some evidence for this, I'll show you in a second, that the fundamental problem that Dubé and others have identified is that minimum wages are associated with economic shocks. And looking across a border in a nearby region minimizes that. But in fact, those shocks could be more important in driving minimum wage variation along a border than they are between different pairs of states. So think about it this way. Take the Georgia-South Carolina border, okay? Those states are fairly similar politically, quite conservative. Georgia has recently become more democratic, but still conservative. So other things that might determine if one state raises its minimum wage and the other doesn't, like very different politics or very different strength of labor unions, is probably pretty unimportant. Whereas if I say, how does the minimum wage compare between California and South Carolina? Now I'm comparing a very conservative state with the most liberal state, very strong labor unions, Democrats in complete control. Maybe the minimum wage variation that comes from politics is actually the right kind of minimum wage variation to do the experiment, because it's not minimum wage variation that's driven by what's happened to the economy on either side of the border. So far, that's speculation. But I want to show you some evidence that that's actually true. Second and last regression table. So here what I do is I divide the sample up. Okay? The first row, where's the pointer? There it is. The first row is the standard panel data estimator, as I said, just differences between two places, between counties or that raise the minimum wage and don't. But you don't restrict attention along the border. There you get a negative estimate, actually a bigger elasticity, kind of minus 0.3 no matter what. Then I do the cross-border, I'm sorry, the pointer is moving a little slowly. The cross-border research design, but I split up the counties. In the first column, I'm going to turn the pointer off because it's a little slow, sorry. Get it out there, okay. In the first column, I take the counties on opposite side of the border, but I throw out the ones that are not in the same commuting zone. So I throw out the ones where the shocks actually are less similar on two sides of the border. On the second column, I take the reverse. I take all the counties on the border that are in the same commuting zones. And the key point, and you can see it in the second row, is that in the first case, that's when the estimate goes to 0. In the second case, when you restrict attention to the same commuting zone, they don't. Still a negative estimate, now minus 0.16, similar to those estimates I started with 40 minutes ago. And in the third column, I think it's a better estimate. Now I don't just restrict attention to the border, because why should you? I just take all cross-border counties, whether they're right on the border or not, so you see the word contiguous is not there anymore. in the same commuting zone. So now I'm using sort of the entire commuting zone on one side of the border as a control for the other. And then you get even stronger evidence of negative minimum wage effects. Oh, I lied. 3 regression tables, sorry. This last slide says there actually is a positive bias in the DLR estimates. I'm going to use the pointer even though I said I wasn't. Where is it? Okay. Right here, what this estimate says is that in the years preceding the minimum wage increase, so year 3 before to year 1 before, there's a growth in employment associated with the following year's minimum wage increase. So minimum wages are going up on one side of the border and not the other, only in column 1, when you use cross-border counties not in the same commuting zones. Why might that be happening? I can only speculate, but my theory is that minimum wages are decided at the state level. Politicians like to raise minimum wages. They're very popular with the public, even in conservative states. But they don't want to do it when the economy is doing badly because then they're going to get blamed for the economy doing badly. So they do it when the economy is doing well. Now, in the commuting zone regressions in columns 2 and 3, that nets out because you control for the shock, but in the first column, you don't. So summary results, almost done here. When we use this DLR estimator, the cross-border design, but we use commuting zones, which ought to better capture the shocks, we find evidence, like much of the literature, that the minimum wage actually reduces employment and an elasticity of, say, around minus 0.2. I should say that's in this case, it's for the restaurant industry, what I've been showing you, I should have said that, is still the case even implementing their strategy. And theirs is probably their estimate is probably upward biased, which means biased towards 0. So actually, theirs is the study getting the wrong answer. So remember what I said before, that most of the research says employment effects are negative. A small subset of it doesn't. It's these close control strategies. Should we only believe that strategy? Well, what I'm telling you actually is it's exactly those studies and this particular most prominent one that is the one that seems to get the wrong answer. So the combined evidence, I would argue, really should reinforce the view that a higher minimum wage costs jobs. Most of the research points that way, and the research that doesn't, rather than being, the only small set of studies that gets the answer right, is actually a small set of studies that may well get the answer wrong. Now, I want to one last point before concluding. What I am saying here is not that the minimum wage is a bad policy. It's not that the US or Japan or anyone else shouldn't raise the minimum wage. What it says is there are trade-offs. So there may be reasons to raise the minimum wage. In the US, for example, the argument is typically that it reduces poverty. The evidence doesn't really show that, but putting that aside, the point is that you may have a benefit that you think a minimum wage will achieve, and maybe that benefit is important. In a sense, every government regulation probably costs somebody a job somewhere. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, right? If we enact climate change policies, oil workers are going to lose jobs, some of them. Does that mean we shouldn't enact climate change policies? No, because the benefits may well outweigh the costs. But we need to be thinking about these benefits of the cost. We need to be thinking about who gains, what do they gain, how important is that as a social goal, versus how do we, as policymakers, or in our case, people advising policymakers, how do we weigh the trade-offs? What are the benefits? How important are they? What are the costs? Who bears them? How important are they? So that's the sort of conclusion. There really isn't a free lunch here. You don't just get higher wages out of thin air, right? Forcing those wages up has consequences, and they may or may not be enough to deter you from doing it regardless. So I will stop there, and I think we're ready for questions.